Welcome back to the channel, and if this is your first time here, you have chosen the perfect story to start with. Because what I am about to tell you is the kind of tale that will make you question everything you think you know about fate, about power, and about what it truly means to belong to someone. Make sure you are subscribed before we begin, because this story is going to unfold in ways you will not see coming, and you do not want to miss a single moment. Settle in. This one is going to hurt in the best possible way. There is a place that exists between territories, a stretch of land that belongs to no pack and answers to no king. The wolves call it the Gray Margin, and it has no flag, no alpha, no hierarchy. What it does have is a small stone building with 2 rooms and a rusted iron sign above the door that reads simply, Medical. The sign was put there by a man named Aldrich Ashen, a human doctor who had spent 30 years treating wounds that no hospital in the human world would acknowledge. Wounds made by claws and fangs and the particular kind of violence that erupts when supernatural politics spill into bodies. Aldrich was not a wolf. He had never shifted, never felt the pull of a moon, but he had loved one, quietly and without ceremony, for the better part of his life, and when she was gone, he stayed in the Gray Margin, because leaving felt like losing her twice. His daughter had inherited his hands and her mother's eyes, and almost nothing else that could be easily categorized. Lyra Ashen had been born in that stone building on a winter night when the snow was so heavy it muffled even the sound of her own first cry, and she had grown up in the space between worlds, fluent in both, and fully claimed by neither. She had her father's steadiness, the kind that does not announce itself, that simply remains when everything else is moving. She had her mother's instinct, the way she could walk into a room and know immediately who was hurting and where. What she did not have, what she had never had, was a clan mark on her skin or a pack bond humming in her blood. Her mother had been declared renegade before Lyra was born, cast out for the crime of bonding with a human, and that status had passed to Lyra like an inheritance no one wanted to acknowledge, but no one could legally dissolve. In the hierarchy of wolf society, an Omega without a clan mark was not precisely a person. She was a category, a footnote, something that existed in the margins of the law the same way she existed in the margins of the territory, tolerated as long as she was useful and invisible as long as she stayed quiet. Lyra had spent 24 years being both useful and quiet, and she had made her peace with it the way you make peace with weather, not by liking it, but by learning to dress appropriately. She had taken over the medical post when her father's hands became too unsteady for sutures, and she ran it with the same unhurried competence he had modeled for her. Wolves came to her from 3 different factions, sometimes enemies who had wounded each other arriving within hours of one another, and she treated them all with identical efficiency and zero interest in their politics. She did not ask who started it. She did not ask what the fight was about. She cleaned the wound, closed the wound, gave instructions for aftercare in the flat informational tone of someone who has said the same words so many times they have become almost musical. And she sent them back to whatever war they were conducting without her opinion. It was not a glamorous life. It was not a life that would appear in any pack chronicle or be celebrated at any gathering, but it was hers, cleanly and completely, in a way that very few things in her world had ever managed to be. The night that changed everything began the way most significant nights do, without warning and without the courtesy of dramatic weather. It was an ordinary evening in late autumn, the air carrying that particular cold that is not yet winter, but has stopped pretending it might be something else. Lyra was cataloging her supply inventory, a task she found deeply satisfying in the way only someone who has run out of something critical at a bad moment can truly appreciate when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like a pressure change, the way the air feels different before a storm. Except the storm in question was not meteorological. She set down her inventory list and went to the door. The Gray Margin's eastern tree line was about 200 meters from the medical post, and in the moonlight she could see the dark shape at its edge, too large to be any of the animals that normally wandered out of the trees at night. She took her lantern, because she had long since stopped being afraid of things that came out of the dark asking for help, and she walked toward it. He was in his human form, which surprised her, because the wounds covering him were the kind that usually drove a shifter into their animal state as a survival mechanism. He was massive in the way that alpha wolves sometimes were, built on a scale that seemed to exceed what human architecture typically accommodated, and he was lying face down in the frozen grass, with one arm stretched forward as though he had been trying to crawl and had simply run out of the will to continue. There was blood soaking through what had once been a very expensive shirt. There was more blood in his dark hair. There were claw marks across his back that were deep enough to make her exhale sharply through her nose, which was the closest thing to an emotional reaction she permitted herself in working mode. She knelt beside him and checked his pulse, which was present and stronger than it had any right to be given the volume of blood he had lost. Alpha physiology, she noted clinically. Accelerated healing, higher pain threshold, cardiovascular system that kept performing long past the point where a human body would have surrendered. She turned him over carefully and found his face. And even through the blood and the damage, she registered that this was a face built for authority. All hard angles, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone making an architectural statement. His eyes were closed. She did not know his eyes yet. She would not know them until morning. And by then, everything would already be in motion. She got him inside. This was not a small undertaking. He was probably twice her body, weight and completely unconscious, and she had no help, and the stone steps were uneven. She managed it the way she managed most difficult things, with method and without drama, improvising with a makeshift sled she constructed from a canvas tarp and her own considerable stubbornness. Once she had him on the medical table, she worked through the night, cleaning and closing wounds that would have killed a human 3 times over, monitoring his vitals with the steady attention of someone who understood that the difference between living and dying sometimes came down to whether anyone was watching. She did not know who he was. She had seen photographs in political broadcasts, the distant, grainy kind that official PAC communications used, and she had not been paying close attention during those particular broadcasts because PAC politics were something she had learned very early to treat as weather, present, and potentially dangerous, and entirely outside her control. The man on her table was just a man who had been badly hurt and who needed someone to make sure he did not die before his body could catch up with its own considerable healing capacity. She stayed awake. She made tea at some point and forgot to drink it. When the gray morning light began to filter through the small windows, she was sitting in the wooden chair beside the table, and her patient's breathing had steadied into something that sounded almost peaceful, and she allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. She was still there when he woke up. The first thing Caedmon Voss was aware of was the absence of pain, not the absence of damage. He could feel the tightness of healing tissue across his back and ribs, but the acute screaming agony that had been his entire world for what felt like a very long time had receded to a manageable background noise, and in its place was something else entirely, something warm, something that pulled at him from his right side with the particular insistence of a compass finding north. He turned his head. She was asleep in a wooden chair with her chin resting on her fist, her dark hair escaping whatever she had used to pin it back, wearing a gray work shirt with something that might have been blood on the sleeve, and she was the most compelling thing he had ever seen in his life. The recognition hit him before he was fully conscious, before his rational mind had time to assemble context or caution. His beast surged up through his chest, with a force that nearly knocked the breath from his body, and said, with the absolute clarity of something that has never needed to argue its case, "Mate." Caedmon had been king of the Northern Territories for 11 years. He had ascended at 20, younger than any alpha in 3 generations. And he had held the position through a combination of genuine strength, political acumen, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that had made him effective and made him lonely in equal measure. He knew what a mate bond felt like in theory. He had heard his generals describe it, had watched bonded pairs in his court with the detached curiosity of someone observing a phenomenon that applied to other people. He had told himself, in the efficient, compartmentalized way he managed most personal matters, that it would happen when it happened, and in the meantime, there was a kingdom to run. He had not expected it to happen like this, in a stone building in neutral territory, with a woman who had blood on her sleeve and no clan mark on her skin. He sat up slowly, cataloging the damage to his body with practiced efficiency. The wounds were healing well, faster than they should have been from purely biological perspective, which told him his beast was contributing its own considerable resources to the recovery process, motivated no doubt by the proximity of the Omega sleeping 3 feet away. He looked at her again, and the pull was so strong it was almost gravitational. And then his rational mind caught up. No clan mark, no pack bond signature in the air around her, no scent of alpha protection, no political affiliation he could identify. An Omega alone in neutral territory, which meant either renegade or cast out or simply unclaimed. And in the hierarchy of his world, all 3 of those categories carried the same social weight. None. A king could not bond with a woman who did not exist in the official ledgers of Wolf Society. A king especially could not bond with an Omega who had no lineage to offer the alliance tables, no clan to cement in political partnership, no standing that would survive the scrutiny of the council. He was thinking all of this very clearly and very coldly when she woke up. She opened her eyes, registered that her patient was conscious and sitting upright, and immediately shifted into professional mode with a speed that told him she had done this transition many times before. She stood and came toward him, reaching for his wrist to check his pulse. And, the moment her fingers touched his skin, the mate bond detonated between them like a physical event. He felt it. She felt it. He could see it in the way her hand stilled, the way her breath caught, the slight widening of her dark eyes. She recovered faster than he did. She released his wrist, stepped back, and said in a level voice, "Your pulse is stronger than last night. The deep lacerations on your back have closed. You probably have another 6 to 8 hours before the healing is complete. I'd recommend staying off your feet for at least 4. He stared at her. "You know what just happened." "Yes," she said, and went back to her work table. "And you're just going to document your vitals and give you aftercare instructions," she said, picking up a pencil. Yes, he should have let it go at that. He should have recognized the pragmatism in her response as the gift it was, and accepted the clean exit she was offering him. He was an intelligent man. He knew this. And yet, something about her composure, the way she had felt the same seismic thing he had, and then simply turned back to her work, made something in him refuse the exit. "What's your name?" he said. "Lyra Ashen. Medical post, gray margin, unaffiliated." She said it the way someone states their credentials when they have learned that credentials are always the first thing demanded of them. "And you're Keedman Voss, which I realized about an hour into treating you when the light got better. I'd have recognized you sooner, but I don't follow the political broadcasts very closely." The fact that she said his name without title, without the weight of deference that everyone in his world attached to his name like a physical object, did something unexpected to his chest. He watched her, and she did not look at him, making notes in a small ledger with the focused efficiency of someone doing their actual job, and his beast was pressing against the inside of his ribs with an urgency that was becoming difficult to ignore. "The bond," he started, "is real," she said, still writing. "I'm aware. It complicates things." She looked up then, and her eyes were darker than he had realized, and absolutely direct. "For you," she said. "It complicates things for you. I'm an Omega without a clan mark in neutral territory. I don't have political complications. I have a supply inventory and a patient who should be resting." He left 2 hours later, when a scout party from his own territory arrived at the Gray Margin's edge, alerted by the tracking stone he wore. He left without resolving anything, which was not how he operated, and his beast snarled at every step that increased the distance between them. He told himself he would handle it. He told himself he would find a way to manage the bond's effects without acting on them, because acting on them was not possible, because the council would never approve, because a king's mate was a political instrument as much as a personal one, and this woman had nothing to offer that table. He told himself all of this very firmly for approximately 3 days before the bond's pull became a physical ache, and his concentration deteriorated to the point where his general noticed and asked him, with the careful neutrality of a man who had served him for a decade and valued his position, whether he was perhaps unwell. Caedmon said he was fine. His beast disagreed, loudly and continuously, in the animal register that lived beneath conscious thought and expressed itself through headaches and sleeplessness, and the particular miserable restlessness of a creature that knows exactly what it needs and is being prevented from having it. If you have ever watched someone make a decision they know is wrong and do it anyway because the alternative requires them to dismantle something they have spent years constructing, then you know what happened next. If you have ever been that person, then you know it even better. And I want you to hit that like button right now, because this story is about to get complicated in a way that is going to stay with you. Caedmon returned to the gray margin on the 7th day. He told himself he was returning to thank her properly for the medical care. He told himself it was a matter of honor and courtesy, nothing more. He told himself this until he was standing outside the stone building in the late afternoon light, and his beast had gone so quiet with anticipatory relief that the silence inside him was almost startling. She was treating a patient when he came in, a young Delta from one of the southern clans with a badly broken arm, and she finished the procedure with complete focus before she acknowledged him. He waited. He was not accustomed to waiting. He found he did not mind it, watching her work, the quiet competence of her hands, the way she explained each step to the frightened young wolf in a voice that was matter-of-fact and somehow also kind. When the patient was settled and resting, she washed her hands at the basin and turned to him. "Your wounds healed cleanly," she said. "You don't need a follow-up." "I know. Then why are you here?" He did not have a good answer. He gave her an honest one instead. "I don't know." Something shifted in her expression. Very slightly, the faintest softening around a mouth that was generally held in the careful neutral line of someone who has learned not to give too much away. She made tea, because it was that time of day and because she was going to make it regardless of who was in the room. And she poured a second cup without asking him if he wanted one. He sat at her work table because there was nowhere else to sit, and she sat across from him, and they talked. This was not what he had expected. He had expected awkwardness or deference, or the particular performative ease that people deployed around him when they were trying to manage his impression of them. What he got instead was a conversation, an actual one, the kind that moves in multiple directions and surprises you with where it ends up. She knew a great deal about wolf politics from the outside, from the position of someone who had been treating the consequences of those politics for years, without having any power within them. And her perspective was specific and unsentimental, in a way he found unexpectedly bracing. She did not flatter him. She did not perform. When he said something she disagreed with, she said so, in the same level informational tone she used for everything. And when he pushed back, she either updated her position based on his evidence, or maintained it based on her own, and either way she was entirely unintimidated. He came back the following week, and the week after that, and he told himself each time that this was intelligence gathering, that her position in neutral territory gave her information his official sources did not have, that there were strategic reasons for the visits that had nothing to do with the way his entire nervous system settled when he was within 10 feet of her. His beast did not bother with the rationalizations. His beast simply was content, for the first time in 11 years, in a way that Caedmon felt down to the architecture of his bones. It could not last, of course. It could not last because nothing that good in his world lasted without being subjected to the machinery of politics and hierarchy, and the particular vicious scrutiny of people who had decided what a king was supposed to look like and were not going to surrender that image without a fight. The council learned about the visits. Of course they did. He had 100 people whose explicit function was to monitor his movements and report to various interested parties, and he had not been careful because he had told himself there was nothing to be careful about, nothing to hide, nothing that rose to the level of a secret. By the time he understood his mistake, the mistake had already been processed by 7 council members and 2 clan heads and his own chief of staff. And the meeting that followed was the kind that begins with formally closed doors and ends with everyone in the room knowing that the person they are discussing is no longer entirely free. They did not tell him he could not see her. They were more sophisticated than that. What they did was lay out, with great precision and no particular malice, the political reality of a king's bond and what it meant for the alliances currently in negotiation, the clan. Heads who had daughters positioned as potential formal consorts, the Treaty of the Four Winds that depended on the Northern King's bonding arrangement being used as a diplomatic instrument. They laid it all out on the table like a map, and they let him look at it, and they did not have to say the rest, because the map said it for them. A mate bond could be refused. It was painful. It was damaging in ways that lingered for years in both parties. But it could be done, and kings had done it before. And the precedent existed in the law, because the people who wrote the law had understood that kings sometimes encountered inconvenient destinies and needed a mechanism for managing them. Caedmon left the meeting and went directly to the gray margin. This was the decision he would spend years understanding. The way you sometimes make the worst choice of your life with perfect clarity, knowing it is wrong while your hands are already in motion. He walked into the medical post, and Lyra looked up from her work, and the bond pulled at him with an intensity that made his vision blur at the edges, and he stood in the center of her space, and he said the words the law provided for this situation. He said them formally, in the old tongue, the way the rejection had to be done to be legally binding. He said them looking at her because he owed her that much at least, the dignity of being looked at while he did it. And he watched her face go very still and very pale, and he watched her. Eyes go somewhere deep and internal the way eyes do, when a person is absorbing a blow that is too large to process immediately, and he felt every word he spoke land in his own chest like something physical, like his beast was taking the same wound from the inside. She did not cry. She did not plead. She did not say a single word while he spoke. When he was finished, there was a silence in the room that had a texture to it, a density, and then she turned back to whatever she had been working on. Before he came in, and she said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "The door is behind you." He left. He told himself it was the right decision. He told himself it was the necessary decision. He told himself the pain would recede as the bond faded, that this was the mechanism, that both of them would eventually be functional again. His beast disagreed with a ferocity that, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely frightened him. Now I need you to understand something. And this is the part where I need you to stay with me, because what happens next is not simple, and it is not clean, and it is exactly as complicated as real things always are. I need you to drop a comment telling me whether you have ever watched someone make the wrong choice with their whole chest, knowing it was wrong, doing it anyway. Because Caedmon Voss is about to discover that some things cannot be formally rejected, and his beast is about to make that discovery very loud and very clear. The formal. Rejection should have begun the fading process within 48 hours. This was documented. This was established supernatural law, the biological mechanism that allowed rejected bonds to dissolve with enough time and enough distance. Caedmon knew this. His chief advisor had provided him with a document outlining the expected timeline. He had read the document 3 times. On the second day after the rejection, his beast tore apart the interior of his private chambers. Not metaphorically, actually tore apart. Furniture and wall hangings and 2 reinforced doors that had been built to withstand a shifted alpha, reduced to splinters and shredded fabric, while Caedmon stood in the wreckage with his hands bleeding and his throat raw, and the bond pulling at him with an intensity that had not diminished by a single degree. On the 3rd day, he could not eat. On the 4th day, his general came to him with the expression of a man who has decided that professional risk is preferable to watching his king deteriorate, and told him, quietly and directly, that something was wrong. "The bond isn't fading," Caedmon said. It was easier to simply say it. He was too tired for the performance of normalcy. His general, whose name was Bram, and who had known him since they were both young wolves navigating an impossible inheritance, sat down without being invited and said, "Then you need to figure out why." It was a healer who provided the answer, a very old one from the mountain. territories who had been practicing longer than anyone in Kedman's court, had been alive. She came at Bram's request, and she examined the bond the way healers examined such things, through sense and intuition, and the particular knowledge that accumulates over a century of watching the supernatural world do what it does. When she was finished, she sat across from Kedman, and she looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is about to say something that will reorganize everything. "The bond cannot be formally rejected," she said. "Not this one. The law accounts for ordinary bonds," she said. "What you have is not ordinary. I have seen this once before, in the records, very old accounts, from before the council systematized the bond law. It is called a sovereign thread. It forms only between an alpha of genuine kingship and a mate whose blood carries a specific lineage that the old magic recognizes as its counterpart." She paused. "The formal rejection you performed was legally registered, but biologically, supernaturally, it did not take. It cannot take. The thread is not subject to the formal law because the formal law was written afterward, by people who had forgotten what the thread was." Kedman was very still. "What lineage?" The healer met his eyes. "The Ashen line," she said. "The true Ashen line, not the branch that was declared renegade. Your Omega is not what the records say she is. There are moments that function as hinges, that swing. A door open on a room you did not know was there, and you stand in the threshold and everything you thought you understood about the layout of the house turns out to have been missing an entire wing. This was one of those moments, and the room it opened on was not a comfortable one. Because if the healer was right, and Kedman's instincts were screaming that she was, then Lyra Ashen was not simply an unclaimed Omega in neutral territory. She was the heir to one of the oldest bloodlines in Wolf. History, a lineage that had been deliberately erased from the public record 3 generations ago by a council that had understood what that bloodline represented and had decided that representation was inconvenient. She was also, if that lineage was genuine, in significant danger, because the people who had erased her grandmother's name from the records were not dead. Their descendants sat on the council, and if they learned that the last of the Ashen blood was alive, documented and bonded to the king, they would understand immediately what that combination meant for the power structures they had spent 3 generations building. Kedman was moving before the healer had finished speaking, and Bram was already at the door, and neither of them said the word danger out loud because they were both thinking it too loudly for speech to add anything. Subscribe right now if you are not already subscribed, because I promise you this story is about to escalate in ways that will keep you absolutely riveted. And you do not want to find out later that you missed any of it. The gray margin had 2 roads in and 1 road out, which Lyra had always considered a reasonable metaphor for the political situation of anyone who existed outside the formal territorial system. She was familiar with all 3 routes, and she had a working knowledge of the gray margin's defensive geography from years of being the only medical resource for a population that occasionally had enemies following it. She was not, however, familiar with being the thing that someone was following, and it took her longer than she would have liked to notice the signs. The unfamiliar scent at the tree line on Tuesday. The sounds of movement at the eastern edge on Wednesday night, stopping when she opened the door to check. The patient who came for treatment on Thursday, whose wounds were superficial and whose eyes tracked the layout of her building with the particular methodical attention that had nothing to do with medical need. By Thursday evening, she had packed a go-bag, which she kept in the medical post's back storage for the theoretical emergency her father had always told her to prepare for, even though she had never truly believed she would need it. She did not know what was coming or why, but she had spent 24 years living in the margins of a world that did not officially acknowledge her existence, and she had learned to trust the particular low-level alarm that sounded in her blood when something was wrong. She was checking the storage room's window latch when she heard the front door open. She came out of the storage room with a medical instrument in her hand that was technically for setting bones, but would function adequately as a striking weapon if required, and found Kedman Voss standing in the middle of her medical post, looking like he had been running, and like the running had not been his primary physical activity recently. There was genuine urgency in his face. There was also, underneath it, something that was not urgency. Something that flinched when their eyes met. Something that looked like it had been flinching for days. She looked at him and felt the bond. which she had been managing through the disciplined application of every mental technique she had ever developed for separating what she felt from what she chose to engage with. She had been doing reasonably well, in the way that you do reasonably well at something when you are working extremely hard at it and not sleeping, and occasionally finding yourself standing at the window staring at nothing. She looked at him, and the management structure she had built over the past several days developed a significant crack. "I need you to leave with me," he said. "Now. Tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. "No, Lyra, you formally rejected the bond," she said, in the old tongue. "With legal witnesses, I assume. That was a comprehensive statement of your position. I received it. I don't need a follow-up. They're coming for you." He closed the distance between them in 3 strides, and she held her ground, because she had been holding her ground against various pressures her entire life, and she was not going to stop now, because a man she was unfortunately bonded to was looking at her with something in his eyes that she was not going to let herself name. The Council, the Morin faction, they know about the bond, they know about your lineage, and what you represent to the current power structure is my lineage, she said, and the word landed differently than she intended, with a weight that came from 24 years of being told she had none. He stopped. He looked at her, and she could see him recalculating, deciding how much to say and in what order, and she watched the calculation resolve into something that looked like decision. "Your grandmother was Seren Ashen," he said, "not a renegade." The word renegade was applied to her record 3 generations ago, by a council majority that understood what she was, and needed to remove her from the official lineage map. She was the last formally acknowledged bearer of the founding blood, the lineage that established the original territorial law. Your mother was her daughter, and you are the last one, Lyra said. She heard her own voice saying it from a slight distance, and no one was supposed to know. No one was supposed to know because people with something to lose made sure the records said otherwise, he said. And now the bond has made it impossible to keep you invisible, because a sovereign thread is documented supernatural law, and when the council cross-referenced the bond's signature with the lineage archives, they would have found what a sovereign thread requires, she said, and she was not entirely present for her own voice right now, because her mind was doing the kind of rapid restructuring that happens when a foundational assumption turns out to have been built on removed ground. 24 years of being a footnote. 24 years of being the category that existed in the margins. The blood in her veins was not a lack. It had never been a lack. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the bond was there between them, present and unrefused, regardless of what words had been spoken in what language. And she saw in his face the specific look of a man who has done something that cost him considerably, and is not sure he has the standing to ask for anything in return. She picked up her go-bag. "My father's records," she said. "I need to take the archive." He was already moving toward the back room. "Show me where." They left the gray margin 20 minutes before 3 members of the Morin faction arrived at the medical post and found it empty. The lantern still burning, the tea thing still on the table, and a bone-setting instrument lying on the floor where it had been set down in a hurry. The faction member who had posed as a patient on Thursday stood in the middle of the empty room and understood, with the particular clarity of someone whose plan has been correctly anticipated, that the situation had become significantly more complicated. Caedmon had a safe house in the mountain territory, one that was not in any official record, maintained through a network of loyalties that predated his kingship and had nothing to do with the council. It was 3 hours by road, and the road was not comfortable, and Lyra spent most of it in the passenger seat of a vehicle driven by Bram with Caedmon in the back beside her, maintaining the 6 inches of distance between them that felt like both too much and not nearly enough. At some point in the 2nd hour, she fell asleep because she had not slept properly in 4 days, and her body made a unilateral decision. When she woke, she was leaning against Caedmon's shoulder, and his arm was around her, and neither of them mentioned it. The safe house was a stone building, which she noted, with a complicated feeling, somewhat smaller than the medical post, and considerably more defensible, with windows at angles that provided sightlines in multiple directions, and a door that had been built to stop a shifted alpha. Bram established a perimeter and made contact with 2 other people whose names she did not know. And Caedmon built a fire and found food. And Lyra sat at the wooden table in the main room and spread out her father's archive and began to read. The archive was 30 years. Of her father's documentation, his own careful record of everything he had observed and treated and understood about the world he had married into. It was also, she discovered as the night went on, something else. Her father had known. He had known about her grandmother, about the lineage, about what the Renegade Declaration had actually been. He had documented it meticulously in the dry, precise prose of a man who understood that truth needed to be preserved, regardless of whether it was currently safe to speak aloud. He had known, and he had kept it safe, and he had never told her because he had understood that knowledge is sometimes a protection and sometimes a target, and he had been trying, in his careful human way, to keep her out of range. She was crying before she realized she was going to cry, which was an unusual experience for someone who had her own emotional responses fairly well managed. It was not dramatic crying. It was the quiet kind that happens when you suddenly understand something about someone you have already lost, when a decision that seemed like silence turns out to have been love in a language you did not speak yet. She was aware of Caedmon sitting down across the table from her. She did not look up. "He knew," she said. "Yes. He spent 30 years documenting it and never said a word. He was protecting you." "I know." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. "I know he was. That doesn't make it less—" She stopped. The sentence had too many possible ends. He did not offer comfort in the form of words, which she was grateful for. He simply stayed, which was its own kind of statement, and after a while she went back to reading and he made tea, and they spent the rest of the night in the archive together. His notes in the margins as she went through the pages, his understanding of the political context filling in the gaps her father's documentation left. By morning they had a picture, not a complete one. Maps. Never are, but enough to work with. The Morhen faction had held 3 of the 7 council seats for 2 generations. They had been the primary architects of the lineage erasure. Their position in the current power structure depended entirely on the founding blood being absent from the political equation, because its presence would trigger the old law's reversion clause, a provision written into the original territorial agreement that none of the current council members had taken seriously, because none of them had believed anyone carrying that blood still existed. "What does the reversion clause do?" Lyra said, in the voice of someone asking a question they are fairly sure they are not going to enjoy the answer to. "It requires a restructuring of the council's composition," Caedmon said. "The founding lineage holds a formal seat, has always held a formal seat. The seat has been declared vacant for 3 generations. And if it's not vacant, then it cannot be declared vacant. And the 3 seats that were added to the council during the period of the lineage's official absence were added under conditions that the reversion clause renders provisional." He met her eyes. "Meaning, the Morhen faction loses its majority, and the policy framework they have built over 60 years becomes legally contestable." Lyra was quiet for a long moment. "That's why they want me dead. That is why they want you dead." She looked at her father's archive, all 30 years of it, spread across the table in the firelight. She thought about the gray margin, the stone building with the rusted sign, the 24 years of treating everyone's wounds without being acknowledged as anything more than a useful category. She thought about her mother, who had been declared renegade for the crime of love, whose status had been used to erase her daughter before her daughter was born. She thought about a grandmother she had never known, whose name had been removed from the records by people who understood exactly how much that name represented. She thought about Caedmon, standing in her medical post 8 days ago, saying words in the old tongue that had been meant to close a door. She thought about the fact that the door had not closed. She thought about what it meant that the door had not closed. Not just for her. Not just for him, but for the law that the bond's refusal represented. The old magic insisting on its own terms in the face of the formal system's attempt to manage it. "I want to see the founding documents," she said. He blinked. "The original charter? It's in the Capitol archives. I know where it is. I want to see it." She looked at him steadily. "I have standing to request access, formally, through the legal mechanism that the old law provides. If I make that request formally and publicly, it becomes a matter of record that cannot be suppressed. She waited a beat. They can kill me quietly in neutral territory. They can't kill me quietly once. There's a formal legal record of my identity and my standing in the Capitol's official archives. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him moving through the implications, the risk assessment, the logistics, and then something else. Something that was not strategic. Something that was simpler and more fundamental. You want to walk into the Capitol. I want to do it correctly, she said. I want to do it in a way that makes suppression impossible. I want my grandmother's name restored to the record. I want my mother's renegade declaration formally reviewed. I want the founding seat claimed. Not because I want power. I have no idea what to do with power. But because the record is wrong, and I have 30 years of documentation that proves it is wrong, and I am the only person who can put it right. He was quiet. She watched him. The fire had burned down, and the morning light was coming through the angled windows, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had spent 11 years making the calculated decision, and was now sitting across from someone who had made a different kind of decision entirely, and was not sure whether to be alarmed or relieved. If you walk into the Capitol formally, he said slowly, the bond becomes public record. I know. The council will contest it. I know. It will be messy. Legally and politically. It will take time. It will be fought at every level. I know, she said for the third time. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm telling you what I intend to do. She paused. You can come or not come. That's a separate question from the lineage. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You're separating them. Yes, because they are separate. The lineage is mine. The bond is... She stopped, and the word complicated sat between them, and she let it sit, because it was the most accurate available option. Separate, she said again. Lyra. He said her name in a way that she was going to need to address at some point, with that quality in it that the bond made audible. That weight. I performed the formal rejection because I believed the political reality required it. I understood it was wrong in every way that mattered. I did it anyway. He was looking at her with the directness that, she had noticed, was genuine for him, not performed, not strategic, the way his eyes went when he had stopped managing what he was showing. I am asking you if there is any version of the future in which you would be willing to tell me what it would take to make that right. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, Bram was speaking quietly to someone at the perimeter. You'd have to actually mean it, she said finally. Not as a political correction, not as a legal recalibration. You'd have to mean it the way the bond means it, which is completely and without the exit strategy. I know. I don't forgive easily. I'm not asking for easy. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had hurt her, with his whole chest, and was now sitting across a table covered in her dead father's documentation, asking her, without elegance or tactical framing, for a chance. The bond hummed between them, steady and unbroken. The old magic entirely uninterested in the formal law's opinion of the situation. Start with the Capitol, she said. Help me do this correctly, and then we'll see. He nodded, once, with the seriousness of someone who has been given a specific task and intends to execute it. Completely. Then we'll see, he agreed. And I need you to leave a comment right now, telling me what you thought about that moment, because that is the kind of answer that either everything or nothing hinges on, and I have feelings about it. And I want to know if you do too. Getting into the Capitol was a matter of logistics and timing, and the careful use of resources that Caedmon had spent 11 years accumulating against the possibility of exactly this kind of need. He had people whose loyalty was to him rather than to the office, who understood the distinction and had chosen it deliberately, and those people were better at moving through official spaces without official notice than any of the formal channels would have been. Lyra had never been to the Capitol. She had never had reason to go, and the Capitol had certainly never had reason to invite her. She watched it appear through the vehicle's window as they came over the mountain road's final rise, a city built in the old, way with the old materials, stone and timber, and the particular compressed density of a place that had been accumulating itself for centuries. And she thought about her grandmother walking those streets, and her grandmother's name being removed from the record, and what it meant that she was about to walk those same streets and put the name back. Bram had arranged for them to arrive in the early morning, when the official buildings opened but before the political machinery of the day had fully engaged. The Capitol archives were housed in a building adjacent to the council hall, accessible through a public entrance that the founding law had specifically required to remain public. Even though the council had done various creative things over the generations to make the access point technically public, while functionally inaccessible to anyone without connections. Lyra had her father's documentation in a case that Caedmon had found for it, properly organized, indexed in the methodical way. Her father had done everything. She had the specific legal language for a lineage recognition petition, which the old law provided for, and which an archivist named Tomas, who was one of Bram's people, and who had been sitting on a theoretical crisis protocol for 3 years waiting for exactly this situation, had prepared and had ready. She walked into the Capitol Archives public entrance at 7 a.m. with Caedmon to her left, and Bram 2 steps behind and 30 years of her father's documentation under her arm. And the woman at the receiving desk looked up and went very still, in the way that people go still when someone walks in, who should not, by any prior calculation, be there. "I am Lyra Ashen," she said, and her voice was level. "Daughter of Mira Ashen, daughter of Seren Ashen. I am filing a formal lineage recognition petition under the provisions of the founding charter, Article 12, Clause 4, which has never been formally repealed. I would like to speak with the head archivist." The woman at the desk made a phone call. 2 phone calls. The second one she made in a lower voice, turned slightly away, and Lyra noted it and said nothing. Caedmon noted it and said nothing. Bram was already at the door with his hand positioned in a way that looked casual and was not. The head archivist's name was Petra, and she was 60 years old and had spent her career in the archive with the quiet intensity of someone who had chosen this work because she believed in it, in the preservation of accurate record, in the particular sacred function of documentation. She came out of the back and looked at Lyra, and then at the case in Lyra's arms, and then at the petition form that Thomas had prepared, and something happened in her face that was not quite emotion, too controlled for that, but was adjacent to it. Article 12, Clause 4 has not been formally repealed, Petra said, because repealing it would require acknowledging that there was something to repeal. The council voted 3 times to declare it procedurally inactive. She looked at Lyra steadily. Procedurally inactive is not the same as repealed. Come with me. The process took 6 hours. Lyra sat in the archive's formal recognition room, which existed because the founding charter required it to exist, and which had apparently not been used in living memory, and she presented her father's documentation piece by piece, and Petra and 2 of her senior archivists examined each piece with the thoroughness that the law required. Caedmon sat to her left through all 6 hours. He did not speak unless directly asked. He was there as the king, which meant his presence carried legal weight, and his presence as witness to the proceedings would be entered into the record. And that entry into the record was one of the things that made suppression impossible. At some point in the 3rd hour, 2 members of the Morhen faction arrived at the archive's external entrance and were informed by Bram that the building was currently engaged in a formal legal proceeding, and access would be available upon completion. The word currently did a lot of work in that sentence. The word formal did most of the rest. The faction members stood outside, and Lyra knew they were there, and she did not stop working. The recognition was granted at 1 in the afternoon. Petra signed it. Her 2 senior archivists signed it. Caedmon signed it as royal witness. It was entered into the archive's primary ledger, which was not a digital record and could not be remotely altered, in the careful handwritten script that the founding charter required for lineage documentation. Seren Ashen's name was restored to the lineage record. Mira Ashen's renegade declaration was formally flagged for review under the provisions that applied to declarations made under false pretenses. And Lyra Ashen, daughter of Mira, daughter of Seren, was entered into the record as the living heir of the founding blood. She sat in the formal recognition room after it was done, with the signed documentation in her hands, and she felt the weight of it. Not the emotional weight, though that was there too, but the literal physical weight of paper and ink, and the particular specific gravity of truth being put back where it belonged. "Your grandmother's name is in the record," Petra said quietly. She was standing in the doorway with the expression of someone who has spent a career waiting to do something this specific. "As it should have been for 60 years. Lyra nodded. She did not trust her voice for a moment. When she trusted it again, she said, "What happens now? The council will be notified. They are required by the founding charter to acknowledge a lineage recognition within 5 business days. The founding seat will need to be formally convened. The reversion clause will need to be formally assessed." Petra paused. "It will not be immediate. It will not be simple. But it will happen, because it is now in the primary record, and what is in the primary record cannot be unmade." Lyra thought about the gray margin, the stone building, the 2 rooms, and the rusted sign. She thought about 24 years of being a category. She thought about her father, documenting everything quietly, preserving truth against the day it could be spoken safely. She thought about the founding seat, empty for 3 generations, waiting. "I will need," she said, "to continue practicing medicine while the legal proceedings take their course." Petra's expression did something interesting. "The founding seat has historically come with a formal residence in the capital. I'll need a room for a medical practice," Lyra said. Keedman made a sound beside her that was not quite a laugh, and was definitely something. The faction members outside had been joined by 2 more by the time they came out of the archive, and there was a legal advisor with them who immediately began speaking about procedural challenges and timeline disputes, and Kedman stopped walking and turned to look at the legal advisor with an expression that communicated, without any words, the specific quality of patience he was extending, and how finite it was. The legal advisor stopped speaking. "The recognition has been entered into the primary record," Caedmon said. "Any procedural challenge will need to be filed through the formal mechanism provided by the founding charter, which I am sure your clients are familiar with, given how carefully they have managed the documentation that charter's provisions are now being used to assess." He waited a beat. "I would recommend consulting with counsel who specializes in founding law before filing anything, because the provision your clients violated 60 years ago has a separate enforcement clause that has also never been repealed." The faction members left. The legal advisor went with them. Bram watched them go with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific kind of resolution for a long time, and is cautiously allowing himself to feel that it may be arriving. The days that followed were not simple, because nothing that involves dismantling 60 years of political architecture is simple, and Lyra had not expected simplicity. She had expected exactly what she got: a formal process that moved at the pace of institutions, that required continuous documentation and response and engagement, that was periodically frustrating and occasionally tedious and consistently necessary. She had expected a fight, and there was one, conducted in the formal arena of the founding law, with the particular discipline that arena required. She was good at it, which surprised people who had not met her before, and did not surprise Caedmon at all. She had 30 years of her father's documentation, and a methodical mind, and the particular quality of attention that comes from spending years treating consequences and working backward to causes. She understood systems. She understood what happened when a system's documentation was inaccurate and what needed to happen to correct the record. She applied this understanding to the legal proceedings with the same unhurried competence she had applied to wound care, and the proceedings moved forward. Caedmon moved the remaining founding seat's formal convening through the council with the weight of his royal witness status and the specific provisions of the founding charter that even the Morhen faction's most creative legal interpretation could not circumvent. The 3 provisional seats were flagged for review. 2 of the Morhen faction's 3 council members requested a formal assessment period, which was their right, and the assessment proceeded, and the findings were what 60 years of accurate record would have predicted. The provisional seats were not immediately removed, because the law moved carefully, and Lyra would not have wanted it otherwise. What happened instead was a formal acknowledgement that the conditions under which they had been granted were provisionally established, and that the reversion clause would need to be fully assessed before any final determination. This would take time. It was supposed to take time. The founding charter had been written by people who understood that structural change needed to be legible, documentable, and resistant to the same kind of quiet manipulation that had caused the problem in the first place. Lyra's grandmother's name was restored. Her mother's renegade declaration was formally reviewed, and the false pretenses finding was entered into the record, which did not bring her mother back and did not undo the 24 years of being a category, but it put the truth where truth was supposed to live. And that mattered in the particular way that accurate documentation always matters, quietly and completely and without dramatic announcement. Between the proceedings and the documentation reviews and the formal meetings that the founding seat required, Lyra set up her medical practice in 2 rooms of the capital residence that came with the seat, and patients came to her from the capital's territorial margins with the particular relieved look of people who have been told for years that their wounds are not the kind that get treated in official facilities. She treated them with the same unhurried efficiency she had always brought to the work, and she sent them back to their lives with aftercare. Instructions in her flat informational voice, and occasionally she noticed that the patients from the capital's official class were beginning to appear in her waiting room alongside everyone else, drawn by the same human need for competent care that had always been her actual credential. She and Kedman were not simple either, which she had known going in, and which she found she did not particularly mind. They were 2 people who had met in the middle of something enormous, and then been subjected to several additional enormous things in rapid succession, and the bond between them was real, and the damage he had done with the formal rejection was also real. And navigating the space between those 2 true things took time and honesty, and the occasional conversation that was not comfortable, but was necessary. He did not perform the resolution. She had been braced for performance, for the kind of grand gesture that was meant to stand in for the slower work, and he did not do it. What he did instead was show up, consistently, to the proceedings, and to the conversations, and to the medical practice where he would occasionally sit in the waiting room with a case file he was working on while she saw patients. And once he restocked her supplies without being asked. And once he spent an entire evening helping her cross-reference the archive documentation with the founding charter's specific provisions. And once he said, in the matter-of-fact way he had learned she received, "Things better. I would like to be with you for a long time. I am aware this needs to be earned. I intend to earn it." She had looked at him for a moment. That was not a question. "I know," he said. "I am stating my intention. The question is whether you are willing to let me try." "Try," she said. And because she was who she was, she added, "I'll let you know how you're doing." He nodded, seriously, like this was a performance review, which it was, and she found that she appreciated the seriousness, that it matched something in her that had always required things to be what they were labeled. The sovereign thread, the old healer had told them, did not simply create a bond. It recognized a completion, a specific pairing that the old magic had been built to facilitate, 2 people whose combination produced something greater than either separately. Lyra thought about this in the evenings when the formal proceedings were done and the medical practice was closed, and she sat at the desk in the founding seat's residence, reading the documents she was slowly, methodically, restoring to their proper order. She thought about what completion meant for someone who had spent 24 years being defined by absence, by the lack of a clan mark, by the category of the unclaimed. She thought it meant something different than she had expected. Not a solving, not a filling in of the gap, more like a recognition, the same recognition her father's documentation had been offering her. All along, the insistence that she was not what the record had said she was, that the truth of what she was had always existed and had been waiting for someone to look at it correctly. She was looking at it correctly now. That felt like enough to begin with. If you are still here, I want you to know something. This story was never just about a bond or a rejection or a king who made the wrong choice. It was about what happens when a record is corrected, when a name is put back, when the documentation of who someone is finally matches the truth of who they have always been. Tell me in the comments what that part meant to you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because the epilogue is coming and you are going to want to be here for it. 3 years later, the founding seat held its first formal session in 60 years. The chamber had been reopened the previous autumn, cleaned and restored by a team of archivists who had treated the work with the solemnity it deserved, and the seat itself, a chair of dark wood and old silver that had been in archive storage since before Lyra's mother was born, had been brought back to its place at the council table with the particular ceremony that the founding charter specified, and that Petra had insisted on conducting correctly down to the last procedural detail. Lyra sat in it in the clothes she had chosen for the occasion, which were good and plain and appropriate, and she felt the weight of the chair and the weight of the room and the weight of 3 generations of absence that she was representing by being present. And she thought about her grandmother, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about her father in his stone building at the edge of the world, documenting the truth in careful prose against the day it could be spoken. The chamber had 12 seats. 3 of them were different than they had been 3 years ago, because the formal assessment had been completed, and the reversion clause had been applied, and the council's composition had been restructured in the way the founding charter required. The Moorhen faction held 1 seat now instead of 3, which was the number the founding law specified for their lineage, and the 2 additional seats they had been reallocated through the formal mechanism that the charter provided. It had taken 2 years and 4 separate legal challenges, and more documentation than Lyra cared to count, and every step of it was in the record, legible and permanent and resistant to the kind of quiet revision that had caused the problem in the first place. Keedman sat at the head of the table because he was the king, and that was his place, and he looked at her across the chamber when the formal opening procedures were complete, and she looked back, and there was something in the look that required no translation, because they had spent 3 years building the language for it together, imperfectly and persistently, the way things are built when they are built to last. The founding seat cast its first vote that day on a matter of territorial boundary documentation that the founding charter had originally specified and that had been allowed to lapse during the period of the seat's vacancy. It was not a dramatic matter. It was procedural and technical, and exactly the kind of thing that the founding documentation had been intended to govern. Lyra voted according to the charter's provisions, and her vote was entered into the record, the first vote from the founding seat in 60 years, and Petra, standing in the observer's gallery with the expression she had been wearing since the recognition proceeding 3 years ago, pressed her hands together briefly in a way that was not quite applause but was everything applause was supposed to be. After the session, Lyra went back to the medical practice because she had afternoon patients, and the afternoon patients did not adjust their needs to accommodate council schedules. Keedman appeared in the waiting room an hour into the afternoon sessions with a case file and sat in the chair he had established as his chair over the past 3 years, and she passed through the waiting room between patients, and he looked up and she said, "You're early. The budget review finished early," he said. "I have 2 more patients." "I know." He went back to his case file. She stood in the doorway to the waiting room for a moment, looking at him in his chair with his case file in a medical practice waiting room in the capital. A king doing his paperwork in the functional, unremarkable way of someone who has decided this is where he wants to be, and has stopped requiring the decision to be dramatic. The bond hummed between them, steady and unhurried, the old magic doing what the old magic did, which was simply persist. "When I'm done," she said, "I want to go to the archive. There are 3 more documents from my father's records that Petra wants to process. I'll drive," he said, without looking up. She went back to her patients. The medical practice saw 40 patients that week, from 6 different territorial affiliations, from 2 different species classifications, from the full range of social positions that the capital contained. Lyra treated them all with the same unhurried competence, the same flat informational aftercare instructions, the same absence of political interest in their affiliations. She had added a 2nd room to the practice in the 2nd year, when the patient volume made 1 room insufficient, and she had hired a young Delta named Cass, who had been trying to get medical training for 2 years and had been told by 3 separate institutions that her clan classification made her an unsuitable candidate, and Cass was now demonstrating a level of clinical aptitude that made those 3 institutions look like the institutional failures they were. The work was the work. It had always been the work, in the gray-margin stone building, in the Capitol's formal rooms, in the space between categories that had always been where Lyra actually lived. The difference was that the space was documented now. It was in the record. It had a name that matched the truth. She filed the 3 documents with Petra at the end of the week, and Petra processed them with her usual careful thoroughness, and they were entered into the primary ledger in the careful handwritten script that the founding charter required, and 3 more pieces of the record were correct that had not been correct before. On the way back to the residence, Cadman drove in the particular comfortable silence that they had developed over 3 years, the kind that does not need to be filled. The city moved past the windows, and the lights were coming on in the early evening, and Lyra watched the streets and thought about her father, who had never seen this city, who had spent 30 years at the edge of the world, making sure the truth was preserved for the day it could be used. He would have liked Petra, she said. Keedman considered. He would have liked the archive. He would have driven Petra insane with documentation requests, she said. She would have loved every minute of it. Lyra looked at him, at the profile of his face in the evening light, at the particular quality of steadiness that he had, the kind that did not announce itself, that simply remained when everything else was moving. She thought it was the thing she had recognized in him first, before the bond, before the politics, before all of it. The quality her father had modeled, and that she had been looking for in people ever since, whether she had known she was looking or not. "I forgive you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He did not turn. "I know," he said, and his voice had that quality in it, the weight she had learned to hear as the bond's most honest register. "I know you do. I'm still working on forgiving myself. You can keep working on it," she said. "I'll let you know how you're doing." He made the sound that was not quite a laugh, and was always something, and she turned back to the window, and the city moved past, and the Founding Seats residence was at the end of the street, with its lights already on because someone had thought to turn them on before they arrived. And the record said her name, and her grandmother's name and her mother's name correctly, all 3 of them. Permanent and legible and resistant to revision. She was exactly where she was, supposed to be. Not because the bond had put her there, not because the lineage had put her there, but because she had walked into the Capitol archive at 7 in the morning, with 30 years of documentation, and the specific legal language, and the unshakable conviction that the record was wrong, and she was the one who could put it right. That was the work. It had always been the work, and it was not finished. It would not be finished in her lifetime. The restructuring of systems that had been built on incorrect documentation was long work and incremental work and work that required the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, but it was documented. It was in the record, and what was in the record could be built upon. She was going to build. Thank you for spending this story with me. If you made it all the way to this moment, to Lyra Ashen in the passenger seat with her name in the record, and the city lights going on, and a man beside her who is still earning his way back, and doing it correctly, then you are the reason I tell these stories. Please subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more of them coming, and they are the kind that will stay with you. Leave a comment telling me which moment in this story was the one that got to you, whether it was the archive at 7 in the morning, or the formal rejection in the old tongue, or the father's 30 years of quiet truth, or Lyra saying I forgive you in the car on the way home. I want to know. I always want to know. Drop a like if this story gave you something, and I will see you in the next one.